A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The rejection ceremony was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, or at least that's what I'd been telling myself for the past 3 months, while the entire Moonvale pack prepared for the occasion, with an enthusiasm that felt increasingly hollow the closer we got to the actual event. I stood in the central clearing as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed almost mockingly beautiful, given what was about to unfold. Wearing a simple white dress that my grandmother had sewn for my mother's mating ceremony decades ago, the fabric soft and worn but still beautiful in its simplicity, though I couldn't help but notice how it made my already pale skin look almost translucent in the fading light. My silver hair, which I'd spent hours brushing until it shone like moonlight on water, hung past my waist in a cascade that caught the evening breeze and shimmered with every movement, and I knew without looking that every eye in the clearing was fixed on that hair, on my too pale skin, on my violet eyes that seemed to unsettle people even when I was trying my hardest to appear normal and non-threatening. Thorn Blackwater stood across from me, his dark hair perfectly styled and his ceremonial clothing immaculate, but he wouldn't meet my eyes, and I felt the first cold tendril of dread curl around my heart as I watched him shift his weight from foot to foot, like a man preparing to run from danger rather than claim his destined mate. Alpha Marcus Brighthowl presided over the ceremony with the grave dignity befitting his position, his gray-streaked hair and weathered face lending him an air of wisdom that I'd always respected, even when I disagreed with his decisions. And he began the traditional words that should have bound Thorn and me together in the sacred mate bond that every wolf dreams of, from the moment they're old enough to understand what it means to find your other half. The pack had gathered in a perfect circle around us, more than 200 wolves standing witness to what should have been a joyous occasion. But I could feel the tension in the air like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. Could see the way Thorn's mother stood rigid and disapproving at the edge of the circle, her lips pressed into a thin line of distaste that she hadn't even bothered to hide during the weeks leading up to this moment. I'd known, somewhere deep in my bones where instinct lived alongside hope, that this wasn't going to end the way traditional ceremonies were supposed to end. But I'd forced myself to show up anyway, because what choice did I have except to face my fate with whatever dignity I could muster, even if that fate was going to shatter me into pieces that I wasn't sure I'd be able to put back together again. Thorn Blackwater, Alpha Marcus intoned, his voice carrying across the clearing with the authority of someone who had led this pack for more than 30 years through prosperity and hardship alike. Do you accept Lyra Moonwhisper as your mate, to bond with her under the light of the full moon, to share your life and your strength with her for all the days the moon goddess grants you? The silence that followed was supposed to be brief, just long enough for Thorn to speak the words of acceptance that would seal our bond and change both our lives forever. But instead, the silence stretched and stretched until it became something ugly and uncomfortable, something that made the assembled wolves shift restlessly and exchange worried glances that I could feel, even though I kept my eyes fixed firmly on Thorn's face, willing him to look at me, to see me as something more than just the strange girl with the unsettling appearance that his family had spent 3 months trying to talk him out of accepting. "I cannot," Thorn said finally, and his voice was steady even though his hands were trembling where they hung at his sides, and I watched with a strange sense of detachment as my worst fears materialized into spoken reality that I could no longer deny or rationalize away. "I cannot accept this bond, Alpha Marcus. I cannot take Lyra Moonwhisper as my mate because she is not what my family needs, not what I need if I'm to build a strong future, and raise strong pups who will bring honor to our bloodline. He finally looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been guilt or might have been relief, though I suspected it was probably both tangled together in a way that would allow him to sleep at night while I lay awake, remembering this moment for the rest of my life. She's unnatural, cursed with that silver hair and those strange eyes that look like they can see straight through to your soul, and the way she sings under the moon like she's calling to spirits that no decent wolf should be communing with. It's all too much, too strange, too other, and my family deserves a normal mate, a proper Luna who won't make our pups targets for mockery and suspicion. The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to wound in ways that would leave scars invisible to everyone except me, and I felt something inside my chest crack and splinter, like ice breaking under too much weight. Though I forced myself to remain standing, with my head held high, because I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble the way they clearly expected me to. The pack was silent in the aftermath of his rejection, and I could feel their eyes on me, some pitying, some relieved, some openly satisfied that the strange, silver-haired Omega was finally getting what they believed she deserved for daring to be different in a world that valued conformity above almost everything else. Alpha Marcus looked genuinely troubled, his weathered face creasing with lines of concern that I might have found touching if I hadn't been standing there being publicly humiliated and cast aside like something broken and worthless. And he cleared his throat before speaking again in a voice that tried for gentleness, but mostly just sounded weary and resigned. If the male refuses the bond, then by the ancient laws that govern our kind, the bond cannot be forced or compelled, for a mate bond must be freely given and freely accepted by both parties, or it becomes nothing more than a chain that binds without bringing joy or completion, he said, the formal words rolling off his tongue with the ease of long practice, even though I could tell he wished he didn't have to speak them in this particular instance. Lyra Moonwhisper, you are hereby released from this arrangement, and you have until dawn to gather your belongings and depart from Moonvale Pact territory. For it would be too painful for all parties involved if you were to remain here as a constant reminder of this broken bond and the complications that led to its dissolution. The words were kinder than they might have been, delivered with genuine sympathy that somehow made them hurt worse than if he'd been cruel. And I found myself nodding mechanically, even though every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to argue, to fight, to demand answers to questions I didn't even know how to formulate in my current state of shock and grief. I left the clearing without speaking, without looking back at the pack that had raised me after my parents died, protecting them from a rogue attack when I was barely old enough to remember their faces, except in dreams that faded more with each passing year. And I walked through the gathering darkness toward the small cottage on the edge of pack territory that had been my home for the past 19 years, since the night I became an orphan and a burden all in one terrible evening. The whispers followed me like ghosts, voices that thought they were being quiet, but that I could hear with perfect clarity thanks to the enhanced hearing that came with being a werewolf, even one as ostracized and isolated as I had become over the years of growing up different in a pack that valued sameness and tradition above innovation or acceptance of those who didn't fit their narrow definitions of normal. They were saying, I should have known this would happen, that someone like me could never expect to be chosen by a warrior from a good family, that my silver hair and violet eyes were marks of something wrong rather than something special, and part of me wanted to turn around and scream at them that I had gifts they couldn't even begin to understand, that my voice could heal emotional wounds and soothe traumas that their conventional healing could never touch. But I kept walking because what would be the point of defending myself to people who had already decided what I was worth. My cottage was exactly as I'd left it that morning when I'd departed, with hope still flickering stubbornly in my chest, despite all the warning signs I'd been deliberately ignoring, small and cozy with herbs hanging from the rafters to dry, and shelves lined with the healing supplies I'd accumulated over years of training with the pack's elderly healer, who had been the only wolf besides my grandmother to treat me with consistent kindness and respect. I moved through the space mechanically, pulling down a worn leather pack that had belonged to my father and filling it with the essentials I'd need for survival in the wilderness that lay beyond pack territory, though I had no idea where I was going or what I would do once I got there. Only that I couldn't stay here another moment, surrounded by the evidence of my failure to be what everyone had needed me to be. I found my mother's silver hairbrush tucked away in a drawer, the handle worn smooth from decades of use, and the bristles still holding a few strands of her hair that were the same impossible silver as mine, and I held it against my chest for a long moment, while tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over and ran hot down my cheeks. Though I made no sound, because I'd learned years ago that crying where others could hear you was just inviting more mockery and pity in equal measure. My father's journal lay at the bottom of the drawer, the leather cover cracked and faded, but the pages inside still legible, filled with his careful handwriting documenting his thoughts and observations about pack life and healing practices, and, most precious of all, his reflections on his strange, silver-haired daughter who had been born during a lunar eclipse and who he believed was blessed by the moon goddess herself for purposes they couldn't yet understand. I opened to the last entry, dated just 3 days before the rogue attack that had taken both my parents from me, and read the words I'd memorized years ago, but still returned to whenever I needed to remember that someone had once thought I was special rather than cursed. Someone had once looked at my differences and seen gifts rather than flaws that needed to be hidden or apologized for, or stamped out through sheer force of will and social pressure. My Lyra sings to the moon tonight, and her voice carries such power that I can feel it resonating in my bones, and I wonder what the moon goddess has planned for her. What destiny awaits my beautiful, special daughter, who sees the world through eyes that reflect the very color of magic itself. He had written, and I traced the words with trembling fingers while fresh tears blurred my vision and made the ink swim on the page. I packed the journal and the hairbrush along with my mother's cloak, which was made of silver fabric that shimmered and flowed like water when it moved, and that had always made me feel closer to her, even though I could barely remember what her face had looked like or what her voice had sounded like when she sang me lullabies in those years before everything changed. The cloak was too fine for traveling, too delicate and beautiful for the rough wilderness I was about to enter. But I couldn't bear to leave it behind, because it was one of the few tangible connections I had to the parents who had loved me unconditionally in ways that no one else had managed to replicate in all the years since their deaths. I added practical items to the pack as well, knowing that sentiment wouldn't keep me alive once I was beyond pack borders and entirely dependent on my own skills and resources for survival, in a world that was harsh and unforgiving to lone wolves who had no pack to protect them or provide support during hard times. Adding dried meat and journey bread, a fire-starting kit, a warm blanket, a knife that had been my father's, basic medical supplies, and a water skin that I filled from the pump outside my cottage one last time. By the time I finished packing, the moon had risen full and heavy in the sky, illuminating the world in silver light that seemed almost too perfect, too beautiful for the ugliness of what had happened earlier in the clearing, and I felt a pull toward my favorite place, the cliff that overlooked the valley where I'd spent countless nights singing to the moon and feeling, at least for those brief moments, like I wasn't completely alone in a world that seemed determined to reject me at every turn. I left the cottage without looking back, knowing that if I allowed myself to think too hard about what I was leaving behind, I might lose the fragile courage that was currently the only thing keeping me moving forward, instead of curling up in a ball and giving up entirely on the idea that life could hold anything better than what I'd experienced so far. The path to the cliff was familiar even in darkness, my feet finding the way through memory and instinct, and when I emerged onto the rocky outcropping that jutted out over empty air, with nothing but moonlight and stars above me, and the sleeping valley spread out below like a painting done in shades of silver and shadow, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been wound tight since the moment Thorn had spoken his rejection. I sat down on the cold stone and let my pack slide off my shoulders. Then I tilted my face up to the moon that hung huge and luminous in the sky above me. And I opened my mouth and let the song that had been building inside me all evening finally pour out into the night air in a cascade of sound that was nothing like the healing songs I usually sang for pack members who were injured or traumatized or in need of comfort. This song was raw and honest and filled with every ounce of pain and loneliness and exhaustion I'd been carrying for years, decades even. This song was my heart breaking open and spilling all its secrets out into the universe without filters or prettiness, or any attempt to make it palatable for listeners who might judge me for feeling too much, or wanting too much, or being too much in every way that mattered. I sang about being unwanted from the moment I was born, different. About watching other pups grow up surrounded by love and acceptance, while I hovered on the edges of pack life, always present, but never truly included. About losing my parents and having no one step forward to take their place in my heart or my life. About years of using my gifts to help others while they used my services, but never truly valued me as a person, rather than just a useful tool they could pick up and put down at their convenience. The song poured out of me like water from a broken dam, and I sang about wanting to be chosen, about yearning to belong somewhere, about the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, someone somewhere would look at my silver hair and violet eyes and strange gifts and see something beautiful rather than something wrong or cursed or fundamentally broken in ways that could never be fixed, no matter how hard I tried to change or adapt or make myself smaller and less noticeable. I sang about rejection and abandonment and the particular pain of being useful, but never valued, needed, but never wanted, present, but never truly seen by the people I'd spent my entire life trying to prove myself worthy to. And as I sang, the moon seemed to grow brighter above me, the silver light intensifying until it felt like I was bathed in illumination that came from somewhere beyond the physical moon itself, somewhere deeper and more ancient than anything I could fully understand with my limited mortal comprehension. My voice carried on the wind, stronger and more powerful than it had ever been before, because this time I wasn't singing to heal someone else's wounds. I was finally acknowledging my own pain and giving it voice and form and substance that couldn't be ignored or dismissed or minimized by people who wanted me to be grateful for the scraps of belonging they'd occasionally tossed in my direction. I didn't know that my song was traveling on mystical currents that had nothing to do with normal sound waves, didn't know that the moon goddess herself was carrying my voice across miles and mountains and forests to reach ears that had been waiting 3 long years to hear exactly this song, exactly this voice, exactly this heartbroken, honest expression of a soul that refused to give up hoping, even when hope seemed like the cruelest joke the universe could play. I didn't know that 50 miles away, an alpha king with silver hair that matched my own had suddenly stopped breathing in the middle of reviewing territory reports, because he could hear my voice as clearly as if I were standing in his chambers singing directly to him. Didn't know that he was already calling for his elite guards and preparing to travel through the night to find the woman whose song had just awakened something in his soul that he'd thought might never wake at all. I didn't know any of that as I sat on my cliff singing my pain to the moon and the stars and the vast, indifferent universe. But I would know soon enough, because some songs aren't meant just to be heard. Some songs are meant to call destiny home, and my song was apparently the kind that could reach across impossible distances to find the one person who had been waiting his entire life to hear it. The one person who would look at my silver hair and violet eyes and strange gifts and see not a curse, but a blessing. Not something wrong, but something perfectly, absolutely right. When the last note finally faded into the night air, and I sat there trembling with exhaustion and emotional release, feeling emptied out, but also strangely lighter than I had in years, I had no idea that everything was about to change. That dawn would bring not an ending, but a beginning, more extraordinary than anything I'd ever allowed myself to dream about in my most secret hopeful moments. I gathered my pack and prepared to climb down from the cliff to begin my journey into exile and isolation. But somewhere in the darkness, silver paws were already racing toward me, carrying an alpha king who had finally found his queen. I returned to my cottage in the darkest hours before dawn, my body exhausted from the emotional purging that had accompanied my song to the moon, and my mind too scattered and raw to think clearly about anything beyond the immediate necessity of gathering the last few items I'd need before I walked away from the only home I'd ever known and ventured into a wilderness that might be physically dangerous, but couldn't possibly wound me more deeply than remaining here among people who had made it abundantly clear that I would never be anything more than a useful oddity they tolerated, rather than a valued member of their community. My throat felt raw from singing with such intensity, such unfiltered honesty, and I could still feel the echo of power that had flowed through me during those moments on the cliff, when it had seemed like the moon itself was listening to my pain and bearing witness to my heartbreak in ways that transcended ordinary understanding of how the universe worked or what forces might be paying attention to the desperate songs of rejected omegas who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to hide behind the careful masks of composure and acceptance that I'd worn for so many years. I was mechanically checking through my supplies one final time, making sure I had everything I'd need to survive at least a few weeks in the wild while I figured out where I was going and what I was going to do with a life that suddenly stretched before me, as blank and terrifying as an empty page waiting to be filled with words I didn't yet know how to write. When I heard them approaching through the forest that surrounded my cottage, the unmistakable sound of multiple large wolves moving with the coordinated precision that spoke of training and discipline rather than the chaotic scrambling of rogues or the casual loping of regular pack wolves out for a night run. My first thought was that Alpha Marcus had sent enforcers to make sure I actually left at dawn rather than lingering and causing complications for a pack that clearly wanted to forget I'd ever existed. And my second thought was that perhaps Thorn's family had decided that merely rejecting me wasn't enough humiliation, and they wanted to add injury to the insult by teaching me a lesson about aiming too high and expecting too much from life. But then I scented the air through the open window of my cottage and realized that these wolves carried scents I didn't recognize, foreign and powerful, and overlaid with something that made my wolf sit up and take notice in ways that sent confusion spiraling through my already chaotic, emotional state. I moved to the window and peered out into the pre-dawn darkness, my enhanced vision allowing me to see shapes moving between the trees with fluid grace that spoke of strength and confidence. And what I saw made my breath catch in my throat and my heart began to pound with a mixture of fear and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something that felt almost like recognition, even though I'd never seen any of these wolves before in my entire life. There were 9 of them total. 8 with fur so white it seemed to glow against the darkness of the forest, like stars fallen to earth, and one whose fur was pure silver that caught the fading moonlight and reflected it back in waves of shimmering luminescence that made him look like something out of legends rather than a flesh and blood wolf approaching my humble cottage in the hours before dawn. They were massive, all of them, easily twice the size of normal wolves, and clearly shifters rather than true wolves given their intelligent eyes and coordinated movements. And the way they carried themselves spoke of elite training and absolute confidence in their own power and capabilities, which meant these were not random travelers or curious passers-by, but wolves on a specific mission who had traveled through the night to reach this exact location for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. The silver wolf moved ahead of the others, his bearing radiating authority and command in ways that made it absolutely clear he was the alpha of this group. And when he reached the edge of the clearing where my cottage sat looking small and shabby compared to the magnificent creature surrounding it, he stopped and shifted to human form in a fluid transformation that was so graceful and controlled, it made me realize just how powerful he must be, because only the strongest alphas could shift with that kind of ease and precision after what must have been hours of running at full speed through unfamiliar territory. The man who emerged from the wolf form was tall and powerfully built with broad shoulders and long limbs that spoke of both strength and agility. But what captured my attention and held it with almost painful intensity was his hair, which fell past his shoulders in waves of pure silver that exactly matched my own impossible coloring, and his eyes, which were a striking silver that seemed to see straight through the walls of my cottage to where I stood frozen in shock and confusion, trying to understand what was happening and why this stranger with my hair and my eyes had traveled to my doorstep at the exact moment when I was preparing to leave everything behind and disappear into anonymity. He dressed quickly in clothes that one of the white wolves carried in a pack, simple traveling garments that somehow looked elegant on his tall frame. And then he walked toward my cottage with slow, deliberate steps that were clearly meant to appear non-threatening, even though everything about him screamed predator and power and danger wrapped in a package that was so physically beautiful it made something ache deep in my chest. I knew I should stay inside, should barricade the door and demand he state his business from a safe distance, should do anything except what I actually did, which was open the door and step out onto the small porch to face him directly. My chin lifted in defiance, even as my hands trembled at my sides and my wolf whined with a confusing mixture of fear and longing that I absolutely did not have the emotional capacity to deal with given everything else that had happened in the past 12 hours. We stood there staring at each other across the width of my small yard, while the white wolves maintained a respectful distance, and the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn. And I felt something shift in the air between us, something profound and significant that made my skin prickle with awareness and my heart race with a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition on a level so deep it bypassed conscious thought entirely. "Please don't be afraid," he said finally, his voice deep and rich with an undertone of something that made my wolf practically purr with contentment, even as my rational mind screamed warnings about strange alphas and unknown intentions and the danger of trusting anyone after being so thoroughly rejected and humiliated by people I'd known my entire life. "My name is Sylvanus Stormcrown, and I heard you singing to the moon last night. Your voice reached across 50 miles of mountains and forests, to find me in my chambers at Lunar Crest Palace, and I knew immediately that I had to come to you, had to find the woman whose song carried such power and such pain that it woke something in my soul that I'd begun to fear would never wake at all. His words washed over me like water, each one seemingly impossible, and yet ringing with a truth that I could feel in my bones, even as my mind struggled to process the implications of what he was saying, struggled to understand how my song could have traveled such distances, or why this powerful alpha would abandon whatever he'd been doing to travel through the night, to reach someone he'd never met based solely on hearing her voice, carried on mystical currents that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught about how the world worked. "Why would anyone come looking for me?" I heard myself say, and my voice sounded hollow and brittle, even to my own ears, scraped raw from singing and crying, and trying to hold myself together through the worst night of my life. Why would you travel 50 miles because of a song when I was publicly rejected just yesterday afternoon by a wolf from my own pack, who looked at me and decided I wasn't worth the complications that would come from having a mate who looked like I do, who had gifts like I have, who would bring shame to his family rather than honor and pride and all the things that normal mates are supposed to bring? I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the fact that the temperature was perfectly comfortable for a werewolf, and I hated how vulnerable I sounded, but I was too exhausted and too emotionally raw to summon the energy to pretend I was stronger than I felt in that moment. "Are you here to mock me too? To see for yourself the cursed Omega with the silver hair and violet eyes, who thinks she has the right to sing to the moon like she's somebody special instead of just another unwanted orphan that nobody wants to deal with?" The pain that flashed across Sylvanus's face at my words was so genuine and so intense that it actually made me take a step back, because I hadn't expected this powerful stranger to react to my bitter accusations with anything except perhaps impatience or annoyance at my presumption. But instead, he looked like I'd physically struck him, and the hurt in his silver eyes was so raw and unguarded that I felt an answering ache bloom in my own chest. "I would never mock you," he said, and his voice carried an intensity that made me believe him despite every instinct I'd developed over years of being disappointed and let down by people who claimed to care. "I came here because for 3 years I've been searching for my true mate, following a prophecy my mother left before she died. And last night, when I heard your song, it felt like every lonely day of those 3 years suddenly made sense because they were all leading me to you, to this moment, to standing here watching you look at me like I'm another person who's going to hurt you, when all I want to do is show you that you're not cursed or broken, or any of the terrible things people have obviously made you believe about yourself." The mate bond, which I'd been too hurt and too closed off to feel when it first tried to snap into place the moment our eyes met, suddenly flared to life with such intensity that I gasped and stumbled, and I felt the connection stretching between us like a silver thread spun from moonlight itself, pulling at me with a force that was both terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. My wolf was practically howling with joy and recognition, throwing herself against the walls of my control and demanding that I acknowledge what she already knew with absolute certainty, that this male standing before me with silver hair matching my own and eyes that seemed to see straight into my soul was ours, was meant for us, was the mate we'd been waiting for, without even realizing we were waiting, because I'd convinced myself years ago that someone like me would never be blessed with a true mate bond. "No," I said, and the word came out as barely more than a whisper, denial and hope and fear all tangled together in a knot so complex I couldn't begin to unravel it. "This can't be real. This can't be happening. I was just rejected yesterday, and now you're standing here claiming to be my true mate like the universe is playing some kind of cosmic joke where I get everything I've ever wanted, right after having it made absolutely clear that I'll never be good enough for anyone to actually choose me. Sylvanus took a step closer, moving slowly like he was approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. And when he spoke, his voice was gentle, but filled with an undercurrent of steel that suggested he wasn't going to give up easily, no matter how much I tried to push him away, out of self-protection and fear of being hurt again. I know you were rejected yesterday. I can feel the pain of it through our bond, even though you're trying so hard to block me out. And I know that makes everything I'm saying sound impossible or suspicious, or like I have some ulterior motive that you can't identify yet, but that will surely reveal itself eventually and prove that you were right to be afraid," he said, his silver eyes never leaving mine, even as I tried to look away, tried to break the connection that was forming between us with every word he spoke and every breath we shared in the gradually lightening dawn. "But Lyra Moonwhisper, I need you to understand something that I think no one has ever told you clearly enough for you to actually believe it. You are not broken. You are not cursed. You are not too strange or too different or too anything except exactly what you're supposed to be, and your silver hair and violet eyes, an incredible gift for healing through song, are not flaws that need to be apologized for, but blessings that mark you as someone special, someone chosen by the moon goddess herself for a purpose that's greater than either of us can fully understand right now." "How can you know that?" I demanded, and I could hear the tears thickening my voice, even though I was determined not to cry in front of this stranger, no matter how much his words were affecting me or how desperately I wanted to believe what he was saying. "You don't know me. You've never met me before. You heard one song in the middle of the night and decided to travel 50 miles based on nothing more than a prophecy from your dead mother and some feeling you claim to have about me being special when everyone else who's ever known me has looked at me and seen something wrong rather than something right." I was shaking now, my entire body trembling with the force of emotions I'd been holding back for hours, or maybe years, or maybe my entire life, and I couldn't tell anymore where the exhaustion ended and the fear began, or how much of what I was feeling was actually mine versus coming through the mate bond that Sylvanus seemed to have no trouble accepting, even though I was still struggling to believe any of this was really happening. My own pack rejected me. The male who was supposed to be my mate publicly stated that I was unnatural and cursed and would bring shame to his family. And now you're standing here claiming that all of that was wrong, and I'm actually blessed and special, and exactly what I'm supposed to be? But how am I supposed to believe you when every piece of evidence I have from my entire life suggests the opposite? "Because I have silver hair too," Sylvanus said simply, and he moved close enough now that I could have reached out and touched him if I'd had the courage. Close enough that I could see the flecks of blue in his silver eyes and smell his scent of pine forests and winter snow, and something uniquely him that made my wolf whine with longing. "Because I know exactly what it's like to be different, to have people look at you and see something other, something that doesn't quite fit into their comfortable categories of what's normal and acceptable. Because my silver hair marked me as unusual even among royalty, and I spent my childhood hearing whispers about whether I was blessed or cursed, and whether the unusual coloring meant I was destined for greatness or catastrophe." He reached up slowly, telegraphing his movement so I had plenty of time to step back if I wanted to, and when I didn't move, he gently touched a strand of my silver hair, letting it slide through his fingers like liquid moonlight. "When I look at you, I don't see something wrong or cursed or shameful. I see someone who matches me in ways that transcend simple physical appearance. I see someone who understands what it means to be marked as different and to bear that difference with grace, even when it hurts. I see someone whose gifts are so powerful that they can reach across impossible distances to call their mate home. And most importantly, I see someone who deserves to be chosen and cherished and valued exactly as they are without having to change or diminish or apologize for their existence. The sun broke over the horizon at that exact moment, flooding the clearing with golden light that mixed with the lingering silver of the fading moon to create an illumination that seemed almost magical. And in that light, Sylvanus looked like something from a fairy tale or a prophecy made flesh, his silver hair gleaming and his eyes reflecting both sun and moon in their depths as he stood before me offering everything I'd ever wanted but been too afraid to reach for. Behind him, the 8 white wolves had shifted to human form and stood in a loose semicircle, all of them radiating power and discipline that marked them as elite guards, serving someone of tremendous importance. And I realized with a shock that made my knees weak that Sylvanus hadn't been exaggerating when he'd mentioned Lunar Crest Palace, that he was actually the Alpha King of one of the most powerful territories in the entire northern region, and he had abandoned whatever responsibilities and duties that position entailed to travel through the night because he'd heard my broken-hearted song and identified me as his true mate. "I'm scared," I whispered, the admission tearing itself from my throat before I could stop it. Before I could hide behind pride or anger or any of the other protective emotions that had served me so well over the years of learning to survive in a pack that didn't truly want me. "I'm scared that if I let myself believe you, if I let myself hope that this is real and you actually want me, and I'm actually your true mate like you're claiming, then something will happen to take it away from me, and I don't think I can survive being rejected again. Not after yesterday. Not after spending my entire life being told that I'm too much and not enough all at the same time. Not after finally accepting that maybe I'm just meant to be alone, because that's safer than constantly having my heart broken by people who decide I'm not worth the effort of loving." Tears were streaming down my face now, and I didn't even bother trying to wipe them away, because what was the point of pretending I wasn't falling apart when everything about me was screaming my vulnerability and pain and desperate, terrified hope that maybe this time things could be different. Sylvanus cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle and warm and somehow grounding in ways that made me realize I'd been floating untethered for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be anchored to something solid and real. And when he spoke, his voice carried absolute conviction that resonated through our growing bond and made my wolf finally settle into something approaching peace. "Then I'll prove it to you," he said, his thumbs brushing away my tears with a tenderness that made my breath catch and my heart stutter in my chest. "I'll prove it every single day for as long as it takes for you to believe that you're wanted and valued and absolutely essential to my happiness and my future. I'll prove it by being patient when you're scared and understanding when you doubt and present, when you need someone to lean on, because the weight of carrying everything alone has become too much to bear." He rested his forehead against mine, and the gesture was so intimate and so perfect that I felt something inside me crack open like a seed splitting to let new growth emerge. "You sang your truth to the moon last night, and the moon carried your song to me. And I answered by coming here to stand before you at dawn and ask you to give me a chance to show you what it means to be truly chosen, truly valued, truly loved by someone who sees all of you, every gift and every wound and every perfect imperfection, and wants all of it, wants you exactly as you are without reservations or conditions or expectations that you'll change yourself to fit some predetermined mold of what a mate should be." I stood there trembling in his hold, balanced on the knife's edge between fear and hope, between the safety of isolation and the terrifying vulnerability of connection. And I knew that whatever I decided in the next few moments would determine the entire trajectory of my life going forward. Would either send me running into the wilderness alone and wounded, or pull me into the orbit of this silver-haired alpha king who claimed to have been searching for me for 3 years and who looked at me like I was something precious and rare rather than something broken and cursed. The mate bond was singing between us now, a symphony of recognition and longing and rightness that my wolf embraced completely, even as my human mind still struggled with the impossibility of this perfect stranger appearing at exactly the moment when I'd given up hope and decided to embrace solitude forever. And I realized that I was standing at the most important crossroads of my entire life, faced with a choice that I'd thought had already been made for me by Thorn's rejection, but that was apparently still mine to make after all. Behind Sylvanus, the sun continued to rise, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and orange that promised a new day and new possibilities. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear the morning songs of birds greeting the dawn with joy and celebration that stood in stark contrast to the emotional turmoil currently raging through my heart and mind and soul. And I knew with absolute certainty that resonated in my bones and my blood and my spirit, that whatever happened next would change everything, would transform me from Lyra the rejected Omega into something else entirely, someone else entirely. Though whether that transformation would bring healing or more heartbreak remained to be seen, remained to be discovered, remained balanced on the edge of a breath and a word and a choice that only I could make. And the weight of that choice pressed down on me like the entire sky had descended to rest on my shoulders, while Sylvanus waited with silver eyes full of patience and hope and a love that seemed impossible and yet undeniable, waited for me to decide whether I was brave enough to sing a different song, one of hope instead of sorrow, of beginning instead of ending, of choosing to believe in destiny and mates and second chances, even after everything I'd experienced had taught me that such things existed for other people, but never, ever for strange, silver-haired girls who sang to the moon and dared to dream of being wanted. The word yes escaped my lips before my conscious mind even fully registered that I was making the decision, the affirmation rising from somewhere deeper than thought or reason, or the careful, logical calculations that I'd relied on to protect myself through years of disappointment and rejection, rising instead from the place where hope lived eternal and stubborn despite everything life had done to extinguish it. And the moment that single syllable left my mouth and hung in the air between us, I watched Sylvanus's face transform with such radiant joy that it made my chest ache with the beauty of it. "Yes," I said again, stronger this time, more certain, the word gaining power with repetition as I consciously claimed the choice I'd made instinctively, claimed the terrifying leap of faith that agreeing to go with him represented, claimed the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the universe hadn't been punishing me with my differences, but rather preparing me for exactly this moment, exactly this person, exactly this destiny that I'd never dared to dream about in my most secret, hopeful fantasies. "Yes, I'll come with you. I'll give you a chance to prove what you're saying. I'll try to believe that I'm actually your true mate, even though everything in my experience tells me that this can't possibly work out the way you're suggesting it will. I'll be brave enough to hope one more time, even though hoping hurts worse than anything when it gets crushed and broken and ground into dust beneath the weight of reality." Sylvanus pulled me into his arms then, carefully and gently, like I was something precious that might shatter if handled too roughly. And I let myself lean into his strength and warmth, while my mind continued to race with questions and doubts and fears that I knew wouldn't disappear just because I decided to take this chance, but that maybe, possibly, hopefully, could be soothed and healed over time if he really meant everything he'd said about wanting me exactly as I was. "Thank you," he breathed against my hair, his voice thick with emotion that I could feel reverberating through our bond now that I'd stopped fighting it so hard and allowed myself to acknowledge its presence. "Thank you for being brave enough to trust me even a little bit. Thank you for not letting yesterday's rejection convince you that you didn't deserve this. Thank you for singing your truth to the moon so I could find you. Because, Lyra, I have been so lonely for so long, ruling a kingdom by myself and pretending I didn't need anyone, when the truth was that I needed you, specifically you, the woman whose song could reach across impossible distances and call me home to a place I didn't even know I was searching for." His words wrapped around me like the silver cloak my mother had left me, warm and protective, and somehow making me feel safer than I'd felt in years, and I found myself clinging to him with a desperation that should have embarrassed me, but somehow didn't, because he was holding me just as tightly, just as needfully, like we were two people who'd been drowning separately and had finally found something solid to grasp onto in each other. The journey to Lunar Crest Kingdom took 5 days of steady travel through forests and mountains that grew increasingly spectacular as we moved north into territories I'd never seen before. Never even imagined in my limited experience of the world beyond Moonveil Pact's borders. And every single day, Sylvanas courted me with a patience and gentleness that gradually wore down my defenses and made me start to believe that maybe this wasn't some elaborate trick or temporary infatuation that would fade once he got to know the real me beneath the initial attraction of the mate bond. He brought me wildflowers every morning, different varieties that he'd apparently been collecting since before dawn while I still slept, and he'd tell me stories about what each flower meant in the ancient language of the moon goddess's first children. Stories about love and loyalty and destiny that felt like promises disguised as folklore. We shared meals around campfires where he asked me questions about my gifts and my dreams and my thoughts on everything from healing practices to the best way to prepare venison stew. Questions that showed genuine interest in knowing me as a complete person, rather than just accepting me as a fated mate, without bothering to understand who I actually was beneath the silver hair and violet eyes and otherworldly singing voice that had first drawn his attention. The 8 elite guards who traveled with us maintained a respectful distance, but I could feel them watching me with increasing approval as the days passed, and they witnessed how Sylvanas and I interacted, how we laughed together over shared stories, and fell into comfortable silences that didn't need to be filled with constant conversation, how he never tried to rush me into physical intimacy beyond holding my hand, or occasionally brushing my hair back from my face, with touches so gentle they made my heart flutter, with feelings I was finally allowing myself to acknowledge. One of the guards, an ancient wolf named Sage, whose white fur had begun to show silver streaks that spoke of his advanced age and accumulated wisdom, sought me out on the 3rd night of our journey while Sylvanas was checking the perimeter with 2 other guards, and he settled beside me at the fire with the kind of casual ease that suggested he had something important to say, but wanted to make it seem like a spontaneous conversation rather than a planned intervention. "The king has never smiled so much or so freely," Sage said, without preamble, his weathered face creasing with lines that spoke of centuries of experience observing alphas and their mates. In the 3 years since his parents died and left him ruling alone, I have watched him carry the weight of an entire kingdom on shoulders that were too young for such burden. Watched him meet with countless potential mates who were beautiful and accomplished and eager to be queen. Watched him reject every single one of them because something essential was missing, something he couldn't define but knew he'd recognize when he finally found it. And then I watched his face when he heard your song and realized he'd been waiting for you specifically, for your voice and your spirit and your particular brand of strength that doesn't announce itself loudly, but runs deep and steady, like underground rivers that feed entire forests without anyone seeing the source. Sage's words settled into my chest, alongside all the other evidence that was gradually accumulating to suggest that maybe Sylvanus really did want me for reasons that went beyond simple mate bond attraction or temporary infatuation with someone different and unusual, and I found myself crying again, though this time the tears felt different. Felt like release rather than pain. Felt like maybe I was finally allowing myself to grieve properly for all the years I'd spent believing I was fundamentally unlovable and unworthy of the kind of devotion that Sylvanus was offering me with such unwavering consistency. I'm scared that I don't know how to be what he needs, I admitted to Sage, the confession spilling out in the safety of darkness and firelight and this kind old wolf's non-judgmental presence. I've never been anyone's first choice before. Never been someone's priority or their partner or their equal. I've only ever been useful or tolerated or pitied, and I don't know how to be loved in the way he seems to be offering. Don't know how to trust that it won't disappear once the novelty wears off, and he realizes I'm just a damaged girl with some unusual gifts, rather than the perfect mate his prophecy promised him. Sage reached over and patted my hand with his gnarled fingers, his touch gentle and grandfatherly, in ways that reminded me painfully of the pack elders who had been kind to me when I was young before they died, and left me with no advocates among the older generation who might have protected me from the casual cruelty of my peers. You're already healing him just by being yourself and allowing him to be himself with you, Sage said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty that made me want to believe him, even though doubt still whispered persistent warnings in the back of my mind. That boy, that man, that king, he has been pretending to be invincible and self-sufficient, and needing no one for so long that he'd almost convinced himself it was true, almost believed that he could rule alone forever without the partner and equal that every alpha needs to balance and ground them. But you showed him that vulnerability isn't weakness, and needing someone isn't failure, and that the strongest thing any of us can do is admit when we're lonely and reach out for connection, even when we're terrified of being rejected. And that gift you've given him by accepting him and his declarations and his courtship is more valuable than any political alliance or strategic advantage that a more conventional mate might have brought to his throne. The ancient wolf stood, then, his joints creaking audibly as he unfolded his tall frame, and he looked down at me with eyes that had seen generations rise and fall, and knew things about love and fate and destiny that I couldn't begin to comprehend with my limited experience. Trust the moon goddess, child. Trust that she marked you with silver hair and violet eyes and an impossible voice not to punish you, but to identify you, to make sure that when the right person finally saw you, they would recognize you immediately as belonging to them, as being made specifically to complement their particular strengths and weaknesses, and to build something together that neither of you could build alone. When Sylvanus returned from his perimeter check and found me still sitting by the fire with tears drying on my cheeks and a thoughtful expression on my face, he didn't ask what was wrong or demand explanations. Instead, he simply sat beside me and pulled me against his side with one strong arm wrapped around my shoulders, offering comfort without needing to understand its source, offering presence without requiring conversation. And that simple gesture of uncomplicated support made me fall a little more in love with him than I already was, made me start to believe that maybe I could learn to trust this bond and this man and this future that seemed to be unfolding before me with an inevitability that felt almost like destiny. "Tell me about your kingdom," I requested softly, wanting to know more about the place that would become my home if I continued down this path with him, wanting to understand the responsibilities and challenges that would come with being Luna Queen to territories and people I'd never met. Sylvanus's face lit up with enthusiasm as he began describing Lunar Crest, the crystal towers that caught moonlight and transformed it into rainbow cascades, the moon garden where his mother had sung healing songs to the entire pack during times of plague or famine or war, the ancient libraries filled with records dating back to the first shifters who'd learned to walk between forms, the training grounds where warriors practiced techniques passed down through generations, the healing halls where injured or sick pack members received treatment from skilled practitioners who would welcome another healer with my particular gifts into their ranks. And as he spoke, I could hear the love he had for his people and his home coloring every word, could feel through our bond how much he wanted me to love it too, how desperately he hoped I would find my place there and make it mine as thoroughly as he had made it his. We arrived at Lunar Crest Palace on the afternoon of the 5th day, and my first sight of the kingdom took my breath away completely, because nothing Sylvanus had described could have prepared me for the reality of towers that seemed to grow from the mountains themselves, like ice formations shaped by wind and time into impossible beauty. Nothing could have captured the way. Moonstone walls reflected light in constantly shifting patterns that made the entire structure seem alive and breathing. Nothing could have conveyed the sense of ancient power and accumulated wisdom that hung over the place like a blessing from the moon goddess herself. The entire court had gathered to greet their king's return and meet the mate he'd found during his unexplained 5-day absence, and I felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on me as Sylvanus led me through the massive gates and into the central courtyard where pack members of every rank and age stood waiting with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism to outright shock when they registered my silver hair and unusual appearance. Sylvanus held my hand tightly as he presented me formally to his people, his voice carrying across the courtyard with unmistakable authority and pride as he declared, "This is Lyra Moonwhisper, my true mate, as prophesied by my mother the Moon Priestess, and she will be your Luna Queen. She will stand beside me in ruling this kingdom and caring for all of you. And I expect you to welcome her with the same loyalty and respect you have always shown me, because she is not just my mate, but my equal partner in all things." The weeks that followed tested me in ways I hadn't anticipated, challenged me to grow beyond the limited self-concept I developed during my years in Moonvale, where I'd been nothing more than a useful oddity that people tolerated. And I struggled with feeling like an outsider again, even though Sylvanus never wavered in his support, and Elena, the royal healer, became a mentor and friend, who patiently taught me about court politics and pack dynamics and the intricate web of relationships that kept a kingdom functioning smoothly. Some pack members welcomed me immediately, drawn by my healing gifts and gentle nature, while others remained suspicious of my strange appearance and unconventional path to the throne. And there were moments when I heard whispers echoing the same cruel judgments that had followed me through my entire life in my birth pack. Whispers about curses and bad omens, and whether the king had made a terrible mistake choosing someone so different to stand beside him. But then, one night, under the full moon, when wounded warriors returned from defending the borders against rogue incursions, and I found myself standing in the moon garden, singing healing songs with my voice amplified by moonlight and ancient magic into something so powerful that it drove away pain and trauma and despair from every soul who heard it. The entire kingdom witnessed what Sylvanus had known from the moment he heard my song: that I wasn't cursed, but blessed, that my gifts were exactly what they needed, that the moon goddess had marked me with silver hair and violet eyes, specifically so I could stand in this garden and heal wounds that conventional medicine couldn't touch. And after that night, the whispers changed their tone from suspicion to reverence, from doubt to gratitude, from questioning whether I belonged to celebrating that I'd finally come home. Sylvanus asked me to complete our mating bond on a night when the moon hung full and heavy in the sky above the moon garden, where flowers bloomed in shades of silver and white and pale blue. And when I agreed without hesitation or fear, when I finally trusted enough to let him mark me and claim me before the moon goddess and all witnesses, the bond that snapped into place between us was so perfect and so right that I knew with absolute certainty that every moment of pain and loneliness and rejection I'd experienced in my life had been leading me to exactly this: to him, to us, to the future we would build together as partners and equals and mates who had chosen each other freely, even though fate had already decided we belonged together. Years passed in happiness and purpose as I established healing programs throughout the kingdom and taught other wolves how to use song and moonlight to address traumas that had festered unhealed for generations. And Sylvanus and I ruled side by side with a partnership that became legendary throughout all the territories. And when young wolves came to me feeling broken or different or convinced they would never find their place in a world that seemed determined to reject them, I would smile and take their hands and tell them my story about being the unwanted Omega with silver hair who sang her heartbreak to the moon and woke an Alpha King 50 miles away. I was rejected and cast out and told I was cursed, I would say to those wounded young souls who reminded me so much of my younger self. I was made to believe that my differences were flaws rather than gifts, that my unusual appearance marked me as wrong rather than special, that my voice was strange rather than powerful. And I spent years accepting that narrative and trying to make myself smaller and less noticeable and more acceptable to people who were never going to value me, no matter how much I diminished myself to fit their narrow expectations. But then I stopped trying to be what everyone else wanted, and I sang my truth to the moon without filters or pretense or any attempt to make my pain palatable. And that honest, vulnerable, powerful song reached across impossible distances to wake the one person who had been waiting his entire life to hear exactly that voice, exactly that pain, exactly that strength, wrapped in what looked like weakness to people who didn't understand that the greatest power comes from being fully and authentically yourself, even when the world tells you that who you are isn't good enough. I would introduce them to Sylvanus, still handsome and strong, and looking at me after all these years with the same wonder and love he'd shown that first dawn when he stood outside my cottage and asked me to be brave enough to hope one more time. And together, we would tell them that rejection isn't the end of your story, but sometimes the beginning of something better. That being different isn't a curse, but often a blessing. You haven't learned to recognize yet that the moon goddess marks some of us with unusual features, not to punish us, but to identify us to our true mates and true purposes and true homes that might be far from where we started, but are exactly where we need to end up. As I stood in the moon garden on yet another full moon evening, my silver hair longer now and adorned with moonflowers that Sylvanus had woven into the strands with gentle fingers, my violet eyes reflecting the light of the moon that had witnessed my transformation from rejected Omega to beloved queen. I thought about the girl I'd been on that cliff singing her despair to an indifferent universe, and I wished I could go back and tell her that her song was being heard, that help was coming, that the pain she was experiencing wasn't the end, but a beginning, that every tear she shed was watering seeds of strength that would bloom into something more beautiful than she could imagine in her darkest moment of grief and isolation. My voice rose in song again, but this time, instead of lament, it was celebration. Instead of sorrow, it was joy. Instead of asking the moon why I wasn't good enough, I was thanking her for marking me in ways that ensured my true mate would recognize me the moment he heard my voice, carried on mystical currents that transcended ordinary distance and limitation. And as my song filled the garden and spilled out across the kingdom, touching every soul with its message of hope and healing and the possibility of happy endings even after the most devastating rejections, I felt Sylvanus's arms come around me from behind, felt him pull me back against his chest and rest his chin on top of my head, felt through our bond the absolute contentment and love and gratitude that he experienced every single day, that he got to stand beside me and build this life we'd created together. And I knew with every fiber of my being that I was exactly where I belonged, with exactly who I belonged with, and that being different and strange and marked by the moon had never been a curse, but always been a blessing I just needed to survive long enough to claim. So if you're out there right now feeling rejected, or unwanted, or convinced that your differences make you unlovable, I want you to remember my story and know that somewhere in this vast world, there is someone waiting to hear your song, someone who will look at all the things that make you unusual or strange or different, and see not flaws, but the exact features they've been searching for their entire life. Someone who will choose you not despite your uniqueness, but because of it. And all you have to do is be brave enough to sing your truth without apology or pretense. Be brave enough to hope one more time, even after hope has hurt you. Be brave enough to believe that the moon goddess doesn't make mistakes. And when she marks you as different, it's not a punishment, but a promise that your story isn't over yet, that your person is out there, that your happily ever after is coming, even if you can't see it yet through the darkness of your current pain, because sometimes the most beautiful dawns come after the longest, darkest nights, and sometimes the person meant for you has to travel 50 miles through the darkness to reach you, but they will come, they will find you, and when they do, everything will finally make sense in ways you never thought possible. If you enjoyed this story of Lyra and Sylvanus, of the rejected Omega, whose song woke an Alpha King and changed both their destinies forever, please let me know in the comments what resonated with you most. Was it Lyra's journey from rejection to acceptance? Sylvanus's patient courtship and unwavering belief in her worth? Or perhaps the message that our differences are often blessings in disguise? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the story, your reactions to the characters, and whether their romance felt authentic and earned rather than just dictated by fate. And if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please consider hitting that subscribe button so you don't miss future stories about werewolf romances, fated mates, powerful Omegas, and Alpha Kings who understand that true strength comes from honoring and protecting those we love rather than dominating them. Because I have so many more tales to tell about wolves who find love in unexpected places and mates who see past surfaces to the extraordinary souls beneath. And I want you to be here for every single one of those journeys, from loneliness to belonging, from rejection to acceptance, from despair to hope. So subscribe now. Leave a comment telling me what kind of werewolf romance you'd like to see next. And thank you, truly thank you, for reading Lyra's story and allowing me to share it with you. Because storytelling is only half complete until someone experiences it. And you've completed this tale by witnessing it, by feeling it, by letting it touch whatever part of your heart recognizes the truth that we all, every single one of us, deserve to be chosen and cherished exactly as we are.